the studios in Brea, California, here is the Doiled In Podcast.
Past Santa Claus in his sleigh and a double row of candy canes, deputy coroners brought the body of 6-year-old Jon Benet Ramsey from her upscale home. Neighbors described the young girl as beautiful and polite. In 1995, she won the Little Miss Colorado pageant. Boulder police won't comment on her cause of death, only saying that she wasn't shot or stabbed. They are investigating her death as a homicide. So far, no arrests have been made.
All right, welcome in, everyone. Today we have a veteran detective, homicide detective, and former sheriff. Fascinating story here, and we're going to be talking about one of the most prolific cases here in the United States, obviously, Jon Benet Ramsey. But welcome in, John Wesley Anderson. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Pete. It's a pleasure to be on your show.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you. Give us a little walkthrough. You have a very fascinating story to how you got all the way to where you are now with the Jon Benet Ramsey case. But let's take it back to where you began in law enforcement in 1972.
That's when I first started, yes, right out of high school, the month after I graduated high school. But I knew I was going to go into law enforcement from the time I was 3 or 4 years old. And I have several people in my family that were in law enforcement. So it wasn't really a question, what do you want to do after high school? That's really where my focus was. One of my heroes growing up was my mother, and she was the first meter maid in Colorado Springs Police Department of the state of Colorado. And I was like 3 or 4 years old, and she'd drop me off at nursery school, and I'd see her later go by the playground on her little 3-wheel Harley Davidson motorcycle, writing parking tickets. And she wasn't an officer, but she had a uniform, and you'd hear the crackle of the police radio from when she'd go by, and I'd watch her go by, and I'd ask her, I said, is this really true? You get paid for doing this? This is the kind of job I want. And so I had uncles that were on the police department and cousins. And so it was really a dream career for me.
A big family business, huh?
Yeah, I guess it was a family business.
So then you went and straight into being on the police department, but then you went to the homicide department.
Right.
Homicide detective, should I say?
Right.
So what was the lure from just being, a regular officer to being a homicide detective?
Yeah. And I have to share the book that I wrote on Lou and Jon Benet, and it was really Lou Smith who really lured me into investigations. And when I first went on the police department, being only 18, in Colorado, at least, you have to be 21 to be a police officer and carry a gun, make an arrest, go to the police academy. So I had a civilian position, and there was a handful of us cadets. And I worked initially in the identification bureau, and you'd fingerprint, and take mug shots, and file reports. But whenever Detective Lou Smith would come into the investigations ID bureau, identification bureau, looking for a criminal record or a mugshot or a lineup or something, I really became fascinated with him. He's such an engaging and interesting person, and he was the first one who really I thought, well, maybe I'm not going to be a uniformed police officer my entire career. Like I thought, maybe I'll be a detective someday. So where I worked at Colorado Springs Police Department, you had to be a police officer in grade one year, which meant you went through the academy, you finished your probation, you were civil service, and then you had to test for it after you'd been a first class patrol officer. So I was focused on that, from coming right out of the police academy, but I had to wait 3 or 4 years before that I was old enough for the next test. And when that test came along, I thought I was ready for it. And there was quite a few other people who wanted to be a detective too. And when the list came out, they posted 17 names, and mine wasn't one of them. And I was just shocked. I couldn't believe. So I talked to Lou, and I said, hey, what did I do wrong here? And I said, my police reports are stellar. I've got almost a perfect record, in convictions, and I'm, never sick, and always early to work, and thought I was doing all the right things. And they said, well, you need to make an appointment with the captain of detectives and see what you can do better next year. And so I talked to the captain, and he says, well, geez, John, if we had picked you, you would have been the youngest detective in department history. But he said, I'm looking at your resume here. He says, you don't even have one college credit to your name. This 75 now. And I said, well, geez, Captain, I said, when I look out there, other than Lou, who had an associate's degree, I don't see hardly anybody out there that has in the detective bureau that had a degree of any kind. And he says, well, John, times are changing. I'm recommending that you go down to the community college, start on an associate's degree and in police science, and take as many classes as you can. Come back again next year. So I did that, and the following year I wasn't number 1 or 2. I think I came out third, in the list, but it was enough to get me into the detective bureau. But I worked property crimes for a year and a half before an opening in homicide came open. But during that time, I was able to work some cases with Lou, and just it even more solidified in my mind that was a career path, being a detective.
Right, right. So then that's great that you actually got to work with Lou on some cases. And what would you say was probably the most memorable case for you that you and Lou worked on together, or maybe just in general for you?
I thought about this, and I was so fortunate working with Lou. I had 6 years as his partner, and we had other partners too. But being able to work as closely with him day in and day out, I was involved in over 100 homicide investigations. Lou was involved in over 200, twice as many as I did. And out of those, I had all but of the homicides assigned to me. I think I had 26. All but one was solved. So I had like 97% clearance rate, 100% conviction rate, which, when you look at the national averages, which is about 76% clearance rate, and almost everybody loses a case once in a while. It's just sometimes difficult to get a conviction, as you well know. Yeah. But anyway, to get to your question, it wasn't until I retired from the police department in 1995 when I was elected sheriff of our county, El Paso County, Colorado. And I had been fascinated and following closely a cold case of a 13-year-old girl who had been abducted in the Black Forest, which is kind of the northeast area of our county, northeast of Colorado Springs. And it was really a tragic case. 13-year-old little girl out of her home, she's abducted. And 2 years later, her skeletal remains are found in a mountainous area of El Paso County. And then 2 years later, the case is still unsolved. And I had been thinking of running for sheriff. In fact, one of my uncles had retired from the police department, was elected sheriff. And I thought, well, maybe when I'm old and gray, like my uncle, I'll run for sheriff. But this case was really on my mind because I was concerned that this killer was still in our community, and the case was kind of languishing. And so I told Lou, I said, I'm gonna announce that I'm running for sheriff, and if I'm elected, I want you to come in as my captain of detectives and take over that investigation. And he too had retired from the Colorado Springs Police Department and had gone to work for the district attorney's office as an investigator. And then he had also worked as a coroner's investigator. So before he came to work for me as the captain of detectives for the sheriff's office, he had been in 3 other law enforcement agencies. So I think one of the things that made Lou so unique in investigations was he saw it from the full continuum, from being a police officer, being a homicide detective on so many cases, but he also knew the medical legal part, from being in the coroner's office, and then understood the role of the prosecutor, and then as a captain of detectives over a number of investigations. When he retired, our detective bureau had at the sheriff's office had solved the Heather Dawn Church case, which is a fascinating case, and we can talk about that if you want. A lot of similarities with the Jon Benet Ramsey case. But when he retired, he set up a cold case homicide team, came back as a volunteer with some of his other friends and some of the other detectives. And I think they ended up with it was something like 106% clearance rate as a detective bureau, because they took several cases off the shelf, cold cases, and they too had 100% clearance rate. So I mean a conviction rate. So remarkable success. So when the Heather Dawn Church case happened in 1996, December 26, 1996,
Right.
within 3 months, the case was really not going anywhere, and the district attorney had determined that he was going. Oh, thank you for putting that
Yeah.
up. This is the Heather Dawn Church.
Correct.
And when the district attorney in Boulder, Alex Hunter, was putting together a task force, he called me and he said, well, I'm looking at this task force where I'm going to have some, stellar homicide detectives that'll be part of our task force, a couple of brilliant prosecutors. He didn't say brilliant. I knew one of them and I knew he was brilliant. I later met one of the other prosecutors, and he too was brilliant. And so this was really an A team that the DA's office in Boulder was putting together. So he said, "Would you recommend that I hire Lou Smith to be part of that and bring him out of retirement?" I said, "Well, absolutely." And I said, "Do the same thing." Alex was his name that I did when I was elected on January 10th, 1995. The day this photograph of Lou was taken was the first day of that I came into office. It was the first day he took over the Heather Dawn Church case. And I promised Lou, I said, anything that you need, I'll give you complete control of the investigation, unlimited overtime, training, travel, whatever you need. And I said, I'm willing to commit to my first term of sheriff to solving the case of this 13-year-old girl. And I said, whatever you need. So I told the district attorney, so do the same thing. Just get behind Lou, support him, turn him loose with all the support that you can get. Because you're not going to find anybody any better to be a part of your task force. Unfortunately, the Boulder Police Department, after 3 months, within probably 3 days, had really fixated on the parents of Jon Benet as or somebody in the family being responsible. Going back to Heather Church just for a moment, that was not that was somewhat of a similarity. Heather's parents were going through a divorce. There hadn't been any violence or anything, but there was references to custody issues, and Heather's parents were very religious.
Right.
The grandparents were very much opposed to the divorce, and they lived in another state. And there were some suggestions that maybe it wasn't a parental abduction, but maybe a grandparent abduction, trying to find a better place for Heather to to grow up. And so in fairness, it is difficult to solve a homicide when you don't have all of the pieces. We talk about this a triad where you have the victim, the suspect, and the crime scene. So if you can kind of imagine, this three-way triad with these three really important elements, and then the more you can connect the victim to the crime scene to the suspect to the victim, the stronger the case is going to become.
Sure.
And in the case with Heather Dawn Church, since she was removed from the house, the crime scene, and her body wasn't found until it was a skeletal remains 2 years later, there's just not a lot to work with there. Right. And that was really problematic for Lou when he took over the case 4 years later. But what he did do was, and he did this with the Heather Dawn Church, the Jon Benet Ramsey case too, is he went back through, instead of looking at what you don't have, look at what you do have. What is the physical evidence? What's the very best evidence that you have? And in both cases of an intruder entering the home. And in the Heather Dawn Church case, the mother died. The father was no longer living in the home. The mother, the evening of Heather's abduction, was leaving the home to go to a church event, and she left Heather, who was 13, and she's in the house. She's a very responsible young girl, in charge of her little brother, who was 18. And when the mother got home, she found Heather missing, and in the little boy kind of traumatized in the crib. He was crying, and it looked like he'd been there for a little while. But the mother, she blamed herself, and she said, when I was driving away, she said, I thought I was so careful because I had Heather, walk me to the kitchen door, lock the door behind me when I got in the car and drove away. And she said, I got halfway to church, and she said, I remembered that I'd left my window in my bedroom cracked just, a couple inches just to get a little, circulation of air in there. And she said, I almost went back, just to, close that window. And she said, oh, no, I'm being foolish. And so she kept going. And when she came home, and couldn't find Heather, one of the first things she did was run right to that window. And it was exactly the way that she had found it, with one exception. And this became very crucial. And Lou realized the significance of this. The screen that had been the type of window that was on her bedroom window was the kind that you have a screen, and then the window opens with like a crank from the inside, and the screen, aluminum screen to that window, POI, point of entry, was in backwards. And what Lou theorized, as did one of the early crime scene investigators, that the suspect lifts the screen out of the track and then reaches in, cranks the window open, steps in with the screen in hand, that puts the screen back in the window. And probably that's about when Heather would have heard something or found him, or he was in the house and then saw Heather, and that's when the abduction occurs. In the Jon Benet Ramsey case, Lou also believed the entry was through a window going into the basement. And that window had, when the crime scene photographs early in the morning of December 27th, 1996, or the 26th, the day after Christmas, when the crime scene photos are studied, that the window in the basement of what they called the train room was standing open, and one of the window panes up near the lock near the top had been broken out. And the window is covered from the outside, this window well, with a heavy metal grate, but it's not welded down or permanently attached, so it can be lifted up. And what Lou believed is that the killer, the intruder, had entered the Ramsey home through that window well. And when he pointed it out to the detectives, who again were very much focused on somebody in the family being responsible, he said, well, this easily could have been, a point of entry, and the window was standing open, unlocked. And they said, oh, nobody could go in and out of that window. And he said, well, yeah, they could. That's how the dad came in, because what had happened the summer before, Jon Benet's father, John Ramsey, had locked himself out of the house, left his keys inside. And so to get back in, he broke the little window pane in that window. He crawled through the window, locked it. And he told me later, said, to my regret, he said, I just, never had that little window pane fixed. And really something that he regrets. Another regret, but you just
hindsight's 2020.
Yeah. It is. They had an alarm on the house when they first bought it, and there had been an accidental. Jon Benet's one actually didn't set off the alarm, and they didn't know it was a silent alarm. And next thing they know is the alarm's blaring. The police are coming down, a fire truck and an ambulance and a police car pull up in front of their house, and they were so embarrassed, and they just didn't want to live, that way where everything is locked up and alarmed. So they just stopped using the burglar alarm, which would have again prevented potentially this from happening.
Yeah, but let's, if I can, go back to the Heather Dawn Church case real quick. That case was going on for, I think, 4 years before Lou came on board, and you guys solved it within 3-4 months. What was it that you guys saw that the previous detectives didn't see, and what led to the actual guy, Robert Charles Brown, his arrest, and what is it that clicked for you guys that didn't click for the previous detectives?
Yeah, you have done your homework here, Pete. I'm impressed.
Trying.
It was all Lou and his team. He never took credit personally. He always gave credit where credit was due, and what was due was the first crime scene technicians had done a good job fingerprinting the crime scene, and Eleanor McGarry was her name, the crime scene tech. It was from Scotland, by the way, a PhD, brilliant lady. And when she first pointed out to the detectives that this could have been the point of entry, the detectives kind of dismissed it. But she is the first one who talked about maybe the intruder came in and then put the screen in backward, because what she had developed was two latent fingerprints, thought to be index. It turned out she was right on the aluminum frame, but the detectives were pointing out, well, that's on the inside, on the interior of the house, and if it's been somebody who broke in, it should have been on the outside. But she's trying to say, well, wait a minute, if the screen was the other way around and was reversed when it got inside, it would have been on the outside. And
Yep.
she didn't get very far with the detectives, I think, for two reasons. I think she spoke with a Scottish brogue and was a wonderful lady, and I loved her dearly. But she was very intelligent, PhD in chemistry. I think she was probably smarter than most any of the guys that she was working for. And she was a civilian. And that was at a time when almost all crime scene technicians and investigators were police officers who obviously are smarter than a civilian
Right.
technician. Now it's almost the other way around. Almost all crime scene technicians, CSI, are not sworn and recognized for being professionals in her field. But she was way ahead of her time. And when 4 years later, when I was running for sheriff and had actually gotten elected, Lou got a copy of the case file before we even started in office, and was going through it. And he called me. He said, "Hey, I'm going to meet Eleanor McGarry for coffee tonight. You want to go with me? Because I think she is the one who really figured out this latent fingerprint that's gone yet unidentified." He says, "I want to talk to her." So when we met with her, it was really a funny discussion. So we're sitting in a booth at a coffee shop, and Lou says, "Eleanor, I really think that fingerprint that you lifted, that unidentified one on that aluminum frame, I think that's what's going to solve this case." And she says, "Well, what took you so long?" She's really funny about it. But it's also, again, that what Lou did with Jon Benet Ramsey. He pointed to the DNA that was under the fingernails on the panties that was within 3 weeks confirmed to not be any member of the Ramsey family by the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, CBI, who excluded all members of the Ramsey family, and did confirm that it was male DNA. And then in 2008, the long johns that Jon Benet was wearing, kind of his pajama bottoms that night, also had unknown male DNA found, trace evidence below the waistband. And although in all three cases they're not complete genetic markers DNA, they're sufficient to let you know that the DNA from the left and right fingernails does have the same genetic markers and is consistent with what's on the panties, which is also consistent later with what's on the long johns. So and I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but in one sampling you get maybe 6 markers, and the next one 9, but the 6 match the 9, and then in the next one, I think with the long johns, we got 14 genetic markers, and they match the original 6 and the original 9. There's also a high probability, based upon the DNA samplings that they've done, that the suspect is likely Caucasian, although they can't rule out all other populations.
Right.
But it does what Lou contended, even on his deathbed in hospice, was it's the DNA that's going to solve this case, and that's what he kept pointing back to on the Heather Dawn Church case. So going back to finish answering your question, what Lou knew at the time, now this is again 95, is that the previous administration detectives had run the unidentified latent fingerprint from the aluminum window through the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, CBI, database, it's called an AFIS, an automatic fingerprint identification system. What we did not have at the time was what they have now is an integrated automated fingerprint identification system, or an IAFIS. And so what Lou and his team learned was that at that time there were 97 independent disconnected AFIS systems. All of them were either in the US or in Canada. And so what Lou said is, he said, well, we know it's not in Colorado. I want you to put together 96 other submission packages. And at the time they were all manual, and you had to, submit a case synopsis and copies, photographs, high res, and then you had to mail those. So he had his team mail 96 submission packages to the US and Canada for every existing law enforcement agency that had a fingerprint database system. And within 10 days, he got the first hit. And it was from California, where you're from. And it was a suspect who was not, he was a convicted felon, and I can't remember the crime. It might have been grand larceny. It wasn't for a sex crime or homicide, but he had been paroled, and had been paroled to Colorado. And so that was the first significant lead. And then within 3 more days, Louisiana came back, confirmed it was this Robert Charles Brown. Brown spelled Browne. And why that's significant is after Lou had and his team arrested Brown for the murder of Heather Dawn Church, he did end up pleading guilty, took a first-degree murder conviction, given a life sentence. What we had to give up at the time was the death penalty. We were in favor of the detectives and myself were in favor of the death penalty. We were fairly confident this guy was responsible for more than just the murder of Heather Dawn Church.
Well, yeah, because by her skeletal remains, there were clothing from another victim that weren't hers. Is that correct?
There was some other articles of clothing and things that were not that didn't belong to Heather, like a different pair of pajamas. But right. What we couldn't figure out, and he never clarified, was did he have other pajamas that he made her wear? How long did he have her alive? And so there was some speculation that maybe she was wearing them, but maybe there was another victim. But in that case, just to conclude on Brown, is after his conviction and he was at the Colorado State Penitentiary, he began corresponding with our cold case team. And Charlie Hess, who was a detective who worked with Lou, and Scott Fisher, another detective. These 3 detectives, retired guys, kept this communication going with Brown, and he eventually confessed to them for 49 murders. Well, if it's true, then he's one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. And one of the things he did is he's in one of the letters he sent kind of an odd poem about 9 virgins laying in a row or something. I can't remember all the details, but I do remember is he had this very precisely drawn map of the U.S. states. And I think there were like 27 states. There's a number of states, mostly in the West, mostly in the Southwest, and in each state that had been individually drawn or traced, is he had a number. So like in Colorado, he had the number 6, California, he had like 3, Washington State, he had like 9, Oregon, he had like 7. And when you add in Texas, I think there was double digits. I think there was 11 or 13. Anyway, when you added all those numbers up, it was 49. And so our team started focusing on, where he was during that time. And they were able to confirm at least 6 bodies that were found, and in several of them, in precisely the manner he described how he laid the bodies out, to include a dismemberment of at least one victim. But the reason I go into a little bit of detail there, Pete, is we were only able to get him convicted on one other case, and that was in Colorado. And so from a cold case perspective, we're confident this guy's responsible for more than 45 unsolved murders. And he did leave us this map of the different states that he was in. So I think with where DNA is today, a lot of law enforcement agencies are having successes on their cold cases, that are 25, 30, 35 years old, and going back and just reevaluating the evidence that was there, and in particular using newer technologies for DNA. And we're able to process DNA in such more minute quantities than what we could before. And our databases, every year keep growing exponentially, both public and private databases. And then the exciting thing, Pete, as you know, coming from California with the Golden State killer, is you no longer have to have the suspect. If you can get a family member, like in the Golden State case, they didn't have the killer identified, but they were able to get in his family tree.
Right.
And there was like a niece or somebody from somewhere in the Midwest, whatever. And so when they got hold of her and said, well, we think you're related, to this person who's responsible for several murders in California. Do you have any relatives there? And she says, well, yeah, I have two. There's one in Southern California. You probably remember this one in Northern California, but that can't be him because he was a former police officer.
Police officer, yeah.
It turns out to be.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, it's incredible. It's incredible how it all, transcends through DNA and back then people didn't even think about that, as a thing that will end up getting them caught. But what do you think, with Heather Dawn Church missing, and then they finally found her body, right, of her skeletal remains. Why do you think that wasn't such? Because many people don't even know that story at all. Why do you think that Jon Benet Ramsey was such a media sensation, and other cases like Heather Dawn Church are not giving so much attention? What is the difference there?
That's a great question, and I think that the answer, at least I believe, it's because the case is still unsolved with Jon Benet Ramsey. When Heather Dawn Church, for those 4 years that she was missing, especially the first 2 years when there was some hope that maybe she was still alive. The picture that you showed earlier was on milk cartons, and you couldn't go into a convenience store without a poster being on the door. And have you seen Heather? And so when the case was unsolved, there was a lot of interest, anniversary dates, birthdays or anniversaries of the murder, a lot of attention around that, re-interviews with parents. And so it keeps the case alive. It keeps it in people's minds and in discussing it, and detectives too. It keeps us detectives, working on the case, because there's human interest. Your captain says, hey, what progress are you making, Pete, on, that cold case there? And, but once the case is solved and there's a conviction, I think that kind of gives us closure, gives family closure, the community closure, and we go on, to look at the next case and the next case and the next case. So when there's no closure, I think it creates perhaps a little element of fear. Is it somebody who lives across the street? Is it somebody that I worked with? Is it somebody that my children may be exposed to yet today?
Right.
So I think that's what keeps in the mind of Jon Benet Ramsey with so many people. It probably, as you know, was probably the most high profile unsolved murder in the at the close of the 20th century, since it happened in 1996. There was another really famous case with some parallels at the beginning of the 20th century with the Charles Lindbergh baby abduction, and both were taken from a second story in their bedroom, abducted. In the Lindbergh murder, the baby was actually taken out of the home, and the body wasn't found until later. In both cases, they have very odd ransom notes and things like that become an issue. So there was a huge interest worldwide on both the Lindbergh abduction and the Jon Benet Ramsey murder. I know shortly after Lou was on the case, I was on a flight to Africa and happened to be going through Paris. and waiting for the flight, I was just looking on one of the television monitors there, and it was the Boulder an international news from Boulder, Colorado, showing that famous photo, at the front of the house. You probably remember it. It had snow on the ground, really an idyllic looking,
Christmas decorations on the lawn.
Candy canes lining the walkway. And so there was just huge, and still is huge interest all over the world. Free world about the case.
So let's talk about go back to the very beginning there, right? So
Oh,
let's
yeah.
look at this here. It's December 26th, like you said, right? So we call that St. Stephen's Day back home. But
Yeah.
in relation to this picture right here,
Mm-hmm.
where's the entry point as far as, and then where the parents sleeping at, and where's Jon Benet?
Yeah, this is a huge home. It's
Yeah.
4 levels. So the entry was made from in the basement through a window well. And then the main level is the next level. Jon Benet sleeping on the second level above ground, and Burke is at the other end. And then above that is a huge attic that had been converted into the master suite. So it's four levels. When the parents bought that home, they'd added on to it and they remodeled it. That used to have an elevator. It was so large that it went
Wow.
up to the top floor, and they took the elevator out and replace it with this spiral staircase. That's somewhat important because the spiral staircase, the bottom step, which is on the main level near the kitchen, is where the ransom note is found by Patsy, the mother, when she gets up on the master suite upstairs, goes down the spiral staircase, and on the bottom step sees these 3 pieces of paper laid out that she would have had to step on. That's what when she first realizes something's amiss and starts reading the paper, the 3 pieces of paper, realizes that it says we have your daughter. She runs back up to the second floor, goes into Jon Benet's bedroom, and she's not there. So of course she screams, calls out to John. He comes downstairs. They search all over the main level. I don't know if initially they went into the basement level or not, but they discussed, well, what do we do? It says don't go to the police, and they made the right decision going to the police. John said no, call 911, and so immediately within minutes of her finding the note, not only are they in touch with the Boulder Police Department, but they dispatch an officer, and within minutes he's at the front door, which is where we have some of the first crucial mistakes, because when he knocks on the front door and Patsy's there, she hands him the note, the ransom note. He looks at it, reads it, hands it back to her. Well, that had it been preserved immediately, I don't know if we ever would have found fingerprints on it or not, or DNA, but what we do know is it got passed around to Jon Benet's father. Detectives started showing up, other uniform officers, commanders, crime scene technicians, neighbors. They even allowed the family priest. As I mentioned earlier, the family is very devout Christians, and so the family priest is in, and they're doing prayer circles. This top photo is the photo for the family photo for Christmas. You can see Patsy sitting, and then over her left shoulder is Burke, who was 9 at the time. Jon Benet again is 6, and then John Ramsey. On the second floor, there's a guest bedroom that used to belong to the older half-brother, John Andrew Ramsey. That year, he had gone on to college, so they converted his bedroom into a guest bedroom.
Right, and it was clarified that he was out of town. He wasn't in the area at all. The half-brother.
Correct. Yeah, he was away, and with his sister, and in fact, the next day, that day, the day after Christmas, December 26th, the Ramsey family we see pictured here were scheduled to fly on John's private airplane. He was a licensed pilot to leave Colorado and go to Michigan, where he was meeting. The Ramsey family was meeting John's other children, a daughter and a son, and I think the daughter's fiance, older daughter's fiance, in Michigan, where they had a vacation home. And so they weren't even in Colorado at the time when Jon Benet's body was found, about 7 hours after they called the police by Jon Ramsey. Then the families rerouted from Michigan, from a flight into Michigan, back to Colorado.
So help me understand with the letter, because there's so many stories out there about the letter itself, right? The 3-page
Right.
ransom note, taken from Patsy Ramsey's own letterhead, I guess, or whatever paper that she had by the staircase with her pen. Um, and I'll put that up there. This is the beginning of the letter right there, where it says, "Listen carefully. We're a group of individuals that represent, blah blah blah."
Right.
And people have stated, well, her handwriting, that second picture there in the bottom, kind of matches that writing. And then some of the verbiage in the letter, asking for $118,000, which apparently was Jon Ramsey's Christmas bonus exactly. What are your thoughts on the letter and any of those scenarios?
Uh-huh. Let me do it in reverse order. And you're right. The bonus amount for Jon Ramsey that year, 1996, was $118,000, which did match what the ransom demand was, within a few pennies anyway. But the way Jon Ramsey explained it to me was, he said, I was given that bonus early in the year, and this was a time before direct paychecks, and you got your paycheck and you had an attached paycheck stub. And he said, so on each paycheck stub, it showed what, you're being paid that month or whatever it was, plus, cumulative. So he said that the bonus amount, appeared on almost every paycheck stub, for that whole year. And he said, when I'd get home, sometimes he said I'd stop at the bank, and deposit it, and then I'd leave the check, the check stub on Patsy's desk, so she'd know how much money was deposited or whatever.
Gotcha.
And her writing desk was there near the bottom step of the spiral staircase, just a short distance away. And on her desk was just a regular notebook tablet. It wasn't her stationery, but it was paper that she would write a letter on. And also the pen that was used was also on that desk. And now going back to looking at the handwriting, there's two critical problems with comparing handwriting to that note. Well, one is the ransom demand is printed. It's not written in cursive. And what we were always taught as detectives, and again, before I became a homicide detective, I worked property crimes and fraud check cases, in cases where you had to prove, a signature, and have been trained that, to get a good specimen for question document examination, you have to use two things. You have to use a ballpoint pen, and you have to compare cursive writing to cursive writing. And in this case, it was a felt tip pen, which is one of the worst writing instruments, because it bends, it gives. So you can't get as precise as you would. But print drawing is really kind of like block drawing. It's kind of like hieroglyphics. It's more drawing than it is writing comparisons. And I talked to Jon Ramsey fairly extensively about this 2 years ago. He was speaking at a CrimeCon convention in Las Vegas, and I flew there to meet with him. We had a long dinner and visited specifically about this and the handwriting. And he and Burke also gave handwriting samples. And the way he explained it makes sense. He says, on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being a definite no, 1 being a definite yes, he said the initial question document examiners gave himself and Burke a 5, saying they absolutely didn't write the note. But he said Patsy was given a lesser number, and he said he thought it was like 4.5. I can't remember exactly what the number was. And that, so they couldn't, that initial question document examiner, forensic examiner, could not say with as great a certainty as they did with John and Burke that they didn't author the note. They couldn't say that with Patsy's. And so that got kind of misconstrued, that we can't eliminate Patsy to Patsy may have written the note to Patsy wrote the note. The other challenge with this one is Lou, when he worked for the DA's office, and then later, after 18 months, when he resigned in protest of the case going to the grand jury, he spent a lot of time on the question document examination, and he found 4 or 5 other expert forensic examiners, and most of them who would look at it said this would generally they would come to the same conclusion. Well, we can't confirm that Patsy wrote the note. We can't rule it out, with one major exception, and this was a very experienced question document examiner with the U.S. Secret Service, and he probably came down with the strongest evidence that, or strongest opinion, that there was no evidence to support any conclusion that Patsy wrote the note. The reason why I think all that's important, and Lou thought that was important, is to draw attention to the question document examination, in many people's opinions, is more of an art than a science, than a forensic science. And in this case, putting all of your belief that, because of one questionable forensic science examination, leading you to believe that person was responsible for the crime, and dismissing the other. And what Lou always talked about was the strongest evidence here, scientific evidence, is the unknown male DNA underneath the fingernails and on the panties and the long johns.
Yeah, and that's just it. It's like, I mean, there's so many things that could point towards a certain person, but if it's not a male, it's really kind of out the window, because where does that male DNA come from?
Right.
I mean, because you even had the housekeeper who really focused on Patsy and said that she was, bipolar, and she was awful to Jon Benet, and I'm not saying that was the case, but you had that there. But while somebody may not be the greatest parent in the world, doesn't mean they do something horrific like that. So it's a big stretch from one thing to another. So there are other people. I know that, like, Fleet White was the neighbor who came over. Did they go to get Fleet White, or did he come over when he saw police cars? How was he there? Was he ever a suspect, or was he just a concerned neighbor?
Yeah, his name came up several times, and I do believe he came over, when he saw everything was going on, and he was close to the Ramsey family. Their family was, and his name did come up as a potential suspect. But I do know this, that the DNA eliminated him very early on, as it did. I think there were like 13 or 15 people eliminated within the first 3 weeks, to include the Ramsey family who was there, Burke, John Andrew, who was not even there. But as you said, the DNA being male excludes all females, unless you buy into, or you're trying to sell some type of conspiracy theory that, well, maybe a woman wrote the note and but a male committed the sex crime. But what they don't realize is the extent of the violence in this sexual assault, and the way that the physical evidence points out. What was the first harmful event, second harmful event, third harmful event, and what all that goes to show, as is plan, design, preparation. And the person who committed this crime certainly brought things into the crime scene, introduced them into this crime scene that were not at the scene, were not found at the scene, to include the cordage that was used to fashion the garrote. That is how Jon Benet was found, was with a garrote tied around her throat, and she was strangled to death in addition to being bludgeoned, she had a severe depressed skull fracture along the right side of her head that ran from the front to the back. And the garrote and what she was tied up with in slip knots was what's known as a paracord 550. That now back in the 90s, that was used mostly by military special forces. It wasn't as popular as it is today. It's used by a lot of outdoor people, climbers, because it's
Sure.
so the paracord's what connects, it's used as suspension lines from a parachute, to a person, when they're parachuting. Very, very, very strong, lightweight, durable cordage. Well, there's no paracord anywhere in the house except for what was found on Jon Benet's body. Lou also spent some time pointing out how the paracord, the one end close that's used in fashioning the garrote, that it had been burnt or singed to keep it from unraveling. The other end of that portion of the cord was frayed, and then the two ends of the cordage that was tied around Jon Benet's wrist in slip knots, so that the more she struggled, the tighter the knots become. Thank you for putting those up. So these are really 5 key pieces of physical evidence. Another one that's here is the duct tape. When the police initially they're thinking it's a kidnap ransom. At least that was the note is. So they are waiting for the killers, as indicated in the note, to make contact with them and go forth with instructions on how to pay the $118,000 ransom. And so after 7 hours, the detective that was there, Linda Arndt, sent Jon Ramsey and Fleet White to search the house again, top to bottom, and see if there's anything that's been overlooked. So when Jon Ramsey and Fleet go downstairs, Jon points to the open window, says, "That's the window that I broke, that I used last summer when I was locked out." And so there's both searching downstairs. Jon opens a door that had been closed that leads into this, what they call the wine cellar. It didn't have any wine in it. They weren't really heavy drinkers, but that's when he sees Jon Benet laying on the floor in a blanket and tied up with this black masking tape over her mouth. So he does what a lot of people naturally do. He rips that off, trying to see if she's needing first aid or whatever. He's relieved to finally find his daughter, and so he grabs her, takes her upstairs. So obviously that contaminates the crime scene, but it was a natural reaction. The point is with the duct tape, and Lou pointed this out. He said, there's not a roll of duct tape anywhere in that house, and there's no evidence that black duct tape was ever used on anything in the house for air conditioning ducts or back of picture frames or whatever. That duct tape is about 6 inches long, and like most duct tape, I think it's like 1.5 inches or 1.75 inches wide, black, which is a little unusual. But both edges had been torn. And so if you could find the parent roll, you can match that serrated, torn edge,
Right.
off the tape to the parent roll. And that was never found. And the other thing that Lou pointed out that almost all the detectives missed was the marks on Jon Benet's cheek. There were 2 marks below her right ear on her jaw, and then 2 on the left side of her back, and they were red, kind of rectangular shaped. What Lou ended up surmising were thermal injuries, burn marks caused from contact with a stun gun. And most stun guns, it depends on the make and the model, they can be used in two configurations. You can either shoot, a dart, actually 2 darts out of the
From a
top
distance.
portion, yeah, and 15 feet or whatever, and connects to the suspect. But you can also remove that cartridge, and you can have direct contact with the 2 metal probes. And if you make contact with the skin with those probes, it can leave these 2 burn marks. And in one of the autopsy photos that Lou pointed out, there's a very faint blue line that runs between those two probes. And what Lou suggests is that was a contusion caused from when the stun guns activated, that the distance between those two probes caused disruption of the capillary of the blood vessels, and underneath the surface of the skin, it caused the faint blue line from the blood underneath the surface of the skin. So Lou was convinced within the first year and a half that a stun gun was used on Jon Benet twice in the marks on the face. He pointed to just below the lip, a faint little piece of the duct tape was still attached to the lip in the autopsy photos. And what he believed is that shows sequence of harmful events. The first contact may have been putting the duct tape over Jon Benet's mouth, applying the stun gun over the top of the tape to control her, removing her from the bed, taking her downstairs, which is where the garrote was fashioned, because some of Jon Benet's hair is embedded in the knot. So the knot wasn't created earlier, it was created there in the basement. And the handle of a paintbrush that belonged to Patsy was taken from a paint tray, and it was broken in 3 pieces. So when they broke the end off with the bristles, it was tossed away into the paint tray, where they got it on the floor of this boiler room. Then the middle portion of this paintbrush handle that was originally about 18 inches long. So the middle portion is what the garrote is fashioned around. And then the other end, the tip of the paintbrush, which would have been another 4 or 6 inches, that's never been found. And not to get overly graphic in this call, and it was one of the things I had to struggle with in my book, and very little of this evidence was reported, that the autopsy concluded that in the vaginal vault there were wooden splinters from the paintbrush inside the victim's body. So it shows foreign object penetration, which again gives you a profile of a very sadistic, violent pedophile who's methodically tying up the child, applying through the garrote constriction of the blood flow. So what it does when you study the pathology of the killer, what did he bring into the home? Well, he definitely brought evidence of what you could say would be in a kidnap kit. You know, the something to tie her up, immobilize her, the stun gun, not to kill her or not to kill somebody inside, but to muffle, to control them, muffle their scream with the duct tape. And all of that ties into the what the note said. You know, we have your daughter. You know, you have to pay this $118,000 ransom. So, and the stun gun was never found. When Lou first talked to the Ramseys about the stun gun, he was still a part of the DA's task force. And he said, "Well, do you own a stun gun?" And they said, "Well, no, we never owned a stun gun." "Do you know anybody who owns a stun gun?" "No, we've never known anybody who had a stun gun." And Lou was convinced the stun gun was used on her twice. A couple of years after his passing, there was a study that was done by 2 medical doctors. And when you look at the wounds that they publish in their chapter of a book on wound pattern interpretation, they're almost mirror images as what you see on her back and that up from her jaw of the autopsy photos.
Right. So there's no doubt about it. I mean, you have those kind of injuries, they're replicating each other. It's part of that kit, like you said. And then we already talked about the unknown male DNA. We've been talking about that. And then the other piece of evidence that is the high-tech boot print. Where was that found? Was that in the basement or?
Yes, on the floor near the body. And it was the basement in that area wasn't used very much, and it was kind of a mildewy, you know, there was like moisture and content. And so the floor was kind of there's debris, mold or whatever, and the boot print was what left. There was a reverse image, and it did read high tech. And what Lou was convinced at the time was that since none of the first responders, crime scene investigators, were known to wear high-tech boots, that the killer likely was wearing high-tech boots. But what we've now found after Lou's passing is a supplemental report from the police department that we got access to through some Colorado Open Records Acts, that we did find a supplement that later did confirm some of the Boulder police officers were wearing high-tech boots. So I'm not sure we can put a lot of confidence that the suspect was wearing the boots, but Lou didn't know that at the time. And I didn't know it at the time that I published the book. That was information that came to us within the last 12, 14 months after the book was on with the publisher.
Yeah. So many people in and out of that house that day that it really
Mm-hmm.
kind of, made a mess of the whole investigation. But so let me ask you this. There's a 3-page ransom note. We've already talked about that, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yet the body is still on the property in the basement. So do you
Right.
think that this was supposed to be a kidnapping based on maybe a pay stub that they found, and they came up with this grand idea like, oh, this guy's got this much money, he put it in
Yeah.
his bank account, I'm gonna go kidnap his daughter, um, take her out of the home, try and get that money from him,
Yeah.
and something went wrong on the way out.
Yeah.
You
Yes.
know, so what's your theory on exactly what happened? And
Yeah, and that's exactly what Lou's theory was, is that he got her to the basement. Lou believed that the killer still intended to get her out of the home. He may have, been intent on sexually assaulting her later, and Lou believed that the large blue suitcase that was propped up against the window, he thought there was a likelihood that the suspect was putting her in this big suitcase, and that if he put that suitcase up in the window well, and this may be where the plan broke down,
Hmm.
is there was no way for the suspect to get up in the window well to get her out of there. And Lou also believed that somewhere here, Jon Benet's dad also confirms this, that Jon Benet was a fighter. She was a very active, young girl. And if someone was trying to take her out of the house, that she would fight them. And so what Lou believed is, as the killer's trying to get her out of that window, is when he's not able to do that. He's not able to complete, what his initial plan was. And that's when the killer takes her to this boiler room in the basement, which was near the train room where the point of entry and likely point of exit was. And that's where the garrote is fashioned in situ, in place. And that's where the sexual assault most likely occurs. Lou believes that's where the second stun gun marked to the back occurs. And as she's fighting and struggling, there's a scream heard across the street by a neighbor by the name of Melanie Stanton, and that happens about 2 a.m. Mrs.
Oh, wow.
Stanton is a light sleeper. She sleeps with her window open just to get fresh air, even in wintertime. And about 2 a.m., she distinctly remembers hearing what she described as a child's scream, the most violent, horrible scream that she's ever heard. So she wakes up her husband, who's sleeping next to her, and says, "Did you hear that?" And he says, "What? I didn't hear anything." And so she said, "Listen." And so they listen, and it's for 15 minutes, they don't hear anything. And what Lou believed is that scream is probably what prompted the killer to bludgeon her, which contributed to her death along with the strangulation. And the question that Lou had to answer, well, how could that scream be heard across the street, and not upstairs, by the parents? And what Jon Ramsey will explain a couple of things is, he said everybody was exhausted in the family because we'd been Christmas Day, then we went to a dinner party that night, and the kids played, and we got home. And said, in fact, Jon Benet even fell asleep, in the car on the ride home, and he carries her up, puts her in her bed, doesn't even take all of her clothes on that she had been wearing that day off. He just leaves her in her long johns and the shirt that she had on. Burke went to bed immediately, but he said everybody was exhausted. Jon says he knew that, it was late. They were getting up, I think, at 5:15 to leave early the next day to fly to Michigan, and for their second Christmas. And Jon did say that he took a over-the-counter sleeping pill, an Ambien or something, but something, that would help him go to sleep. But on the construction of the house, that Lou pointed out, is really important. When the remodel occurs, that the Ramseys do, they added additional soundproofing in the house and in between floors, and the boiler room that was in the basement. The house was over 100 years old and well built, but that basement originally in that room for the boiler had one of those old-fashioned coal boilers. That's how the house was heated. And when it became more modern, they put in a different type of a furnace. But there was a large pipe. It was about a 6-inch pipe vent that from the boiler room was still open, that went outside and faced the street. And the Stanton home was across the street. Right. And what Lou believed is Jon Benet is near there when the abduction is occurring. Maybe this is when the second stun gun application occurs, and she's fighting. And that's when Lou thought that she screams this scream about 2 a.m. that Melanie Stanton hears across the street. But it couldn't carry up from the first floor, the second, third, into the attic.
I was going to say, yeah, you're 3 stories above in a well-insulated house.
And
it's
Lou,
tough.
and Lou reconstructed that. He had people stand on the different levels, and they tried screaming, making real loud noises. But across the street, you could hear it. So I think he does answer that question.
Yeah, and especially if the window's open, that window that he got in through.
Yes.
That's also another outlet for noise to get out.
Yeah, although that was in a different part of the house. I mean, facing a different direction. But you're right, that window is open.
Right. Mm-hmm. Wow. So, yeah, I know you guys are still working on this, and don't want to ask names or anything like that, but you guys are still, as a team, who's part of your team that's still working on this case, because this is ongoing still.
Right.
And I know that you guys, you had mentioned earlier off before we got on here, what you guys are up to. So it gives a little background on what you guys are doing right now.
Sure. What happened was Lou, when the case was brought by special prosecutors to go to the grand jury in Boulder, Lou was convinced they were going after the parents to indict them for murder that they were not responsible for. So in protest, he resigned from the task force. He'd worked for them with the task force for 1.5 years. And then he tried to get in to present evidence to the grand jury. And the special prosecutors said, no, we're not going to let you in. And he said, well, I have evidence that I don't think anybody else is going to show. And I have this PowerPoint presentation that I put together. I really want to testify. And they said no. And he wrote a letter to the grand jury foreman. And the prosecutor said, not only are we not going to let you testify, but we're going to take your PowerPoint presentation. We don't want you showing this to anybody. So Lou had to obtain a legal counsel, and the attorneys that he that ended up working for Lou pro bono was a former district attorney here in our county and a former state public defender. And so the two of them who knew Lou represented him and called the special prosecutor and said, well, if you're not going to let Lou testify, then he's going to go public. And they said, well, we don't want that, but we want his PowerPoint. He said, well, we can take this to the judge and the judge decide. But he said, what Lou has is just copies, copies of the autopsy report, autopsy photos, crime scene photos. He said, you already have everything. And that's where he got this information, a recording of the 911 tape. You have the original. We only have copies. And so the attorney and a judge ended up saying, well, this is all work product from Lou from his investigation, allowed him to keep that. Well, those are the original notes that Lou kept working with until he passed away in 2010. And he kept evolving his theory of the intruder, kept getting more information on the stun guns. He included information such as when the Ramseys passed their polygraph examinations. So he was adding to his slide presentation And he had an extensive spreadsheet of persons of interest, 883 entries, 632 slides of this presentation. So all of this material documentation, his investigative notes, everything that he had. When he passed away, he succumbed to cancer and knew he was dying, and his last few months were in hospice. So we had time, he and I and his family and a number of other retired detectives, to talk about the case, and he'd talk about his top suspects and why this evidence was important, and events that had happened. And his dying wish, Pete, was to make sure that this case does not die with him. And when your best friend's laying there on his deathbed and says, "Pete, don't let this die with me."
Yeah.
So what happened was his children inherits his estate. Lou's wife had already passed on, and included in his estate is his computers, investigative notes, everything that he had on the Jon Benet Ramsey case, plus all of his other investigation notes from Heather Dawn Church and all of the other cases that he's ever investigated. Just a tremendous volume and detail of these homicide cases going back to when he first started as a detective. So Lou's daughter, Cindy, he has three daughters. His middle daughter, Cindy, called within a couple of weeks of Lou passing. And he said, "John," he said, "the family has decided that we're going to put together a team of volunteers, and we're going to continue to try to, complete Dad's work, because we have no confidence in the Boulder police solving this." He said,
Right.
Lou didn't think that they would. They were still focused at the time on the parents. And so she said, Cindy said, "I've talked to a couple other detectives, and Dave Spencer has already agreed to be a part of it." Well, Dave was also one of our partners and a very good friend and an outstanding investigator. And I knew if Dave was on board that, we're going to have some professional, law enforcement representation on there. So I agreed to be part of that team. Dave was the law enforcement lead of us retirees. So we'd meet, every couple of weeks or every month or so, and we'd compare notes. We'd identify from Lou's list, who were what we came up with was our top 20 list. And then from that list, we'd say, okay, let's pick somebody, and let's see if we can either contact them to see if they're, in some cases, willing to give us DNA. In a few cases I mentioned earlier, we actually paid somebody, for their DNA sample, usually just a buccal swab, on a Q-tip, just the oral swab.
Whatever it takes to clear them.
Yeah, right. And we paid for the analysis at a private lab. We had the genetic markers that Lou had left behind in his case filed. Now that's all been made public through Colorado Open Records Act. So you can do the comparison. And in many other cases, and this is where I didn't want to go into a lot of detail since we're still actively doing this, we do try to come up with some way of obtaining discarded DNA. And we've done that in a number of cases. And so far, when we eliminate one person, they go from that list, to list A is our top 20. And then when they're eliminated through DNA analysis, we go to that goes to list B, and then we bring somebody up from Lou's spreadsheet, to keep filling up our top 20. We met twice with the district attorney in Boulder, the police department. We gave them our top 20. We gave them the list of the people that we're working on. We tried to work with them, but they were very insistent that it's a one-way, street. We're not going to share any information. They did take somewhat reluctantly what we gave them. We also gave them a list of the evidence that, from our perspective, hadn't been completely thoroughly analyzed and should be reevaluated, especially using more modern techniques. And so we've met with a number of law enforcement agencies that might be able to support that, private labs. Many of them were willing to do apply their advanced technologies to the evidence, but they had to get the evidence submitted to them, for them to have something to work with. But we had started a GoFundMe account, and so we said, hey, we'll pay for the DNA analysis. Let's use, the latest technologies,
Right.
and won't cost Boulder Police anything.
Yeah.
We'll pay for that. And if we have to, we'll go raise more money. I think the last time that I saw the balance, we'd raised over, I think initially we had gone, we had budgeted for 100,000 is what we were trying to come up with to do our top 10, or I mean our top 20. And we were spending about 5,000, to obtain the analysis, to do the testing. So we thought with our top 20, that'd be about 100 grand. And I think we're over 55 grand, and we've eliminated, and we spent some of that money, but I think we still are right about 20,000. So the fund is healthy, but we
Right.
do know from many of our sources that to include the Ramsey family, if you need more money, you come back and we'll help raise that money. But what we're doing is the job that the Boulder Police should be doing on their own.
Sure.
They should be, going through
Yeah.
that list. And that's one of the challenges that us retired detectives have had is, it's really difficult to investigate a homicide from the outside.
Yep.
When we were there, you had access, to crime labs and databases, systems. You could run somebody on a criminal background. Trying to work this from the outside is really limiting. And we do the best we can with open
Sure.
records and public records, but
Well-
it's really a slow process.
Why do you think it is that the Boulder Police Department has, not followed up on this case and tried to solve it? Since it's such you know, a well-known case throughout the world, it would behoove them, I would think, to be able to solve it instead of letting it just, go.
Right. Yeah, that's really been baffling. What Lou thought it was initially was just a combination of inexperience and arrogance. They didn't want to be proven wrong. There may have been some concern, maybe still be some concerns on some civil liability, for what they put the Ramsey family through. It was a, terrible mistreatment, of the Ramsey family, going to the grand jury and everything. It cost them literally everything that they had. John and Patsy had started the business in their basement from nothing, from scratch, Access Graphics. And the year that the abduction occurs is their banner year. They just went over $1 billion in sales, and for the first time. And Lockheed Martin, a company I know that you're familiar with, aerospace company, had acquired Access Graphics, and so financially, the family, as a business family, things had never been better, and that may be part of the problem, because that was a huge success story in the local Boulder newspaper. Local business does good, and so is that where the suspect first hears about that? Was he somebody who worked for Access Graphics? At one time, they had over 500 employees. So maybe that's how, someone knew that, John was paid $118,000
Right.
for his bonus. I don't know. But there's a lot of lessons learned, in protecting, your identity, your information. One of the things that they did do that they regret is that they had opened up the house, beautiful home, and Patsy had decorated it several years in a row very nicely for Christmas. There's a different Christmas tree in each room, and just beautifully done. But to support a charity, they were one of the Christmas Pray to Homes, where people pay $25 to a charitable donation, and then they come into people's homes and they have cookie and teas or whatever, and
Wow.
go through and look at the
So
house.
you don't know who's
And
coming in
so
or out.
there was a lot of people that had gone through, that home,
Yeah.
the previous Christmas, the one before. So another problem they had is they didn't have a good control of the keys, and I think there may have been as many as 23 different sets of keys that were out there. They had a housekeeper, that you'd mentioned earlier. She had a house key. That one of the neighbors across the street who got their mail, when they were on vacation, and they lost that key, didn't know where it went, and so the Ramseys gave them another key. And it's kind of like, we all say, I just moved into a new house 2 months ago, and you think, oh, okay, I'll get all the locks, refitted and changed all the locks, and you don't,
Yeah.
and you don't know, well, how many keys did the previous owners
Sure.
have, And yeah, we all should be, better at that. Yeah, there's a lot of things in hindsight, that we might have been able to do. But when it comes to the Boulder Police Department, I think at the time there was just this reluctance, of accepting any outside help, whether it was from the Denver police homicide detectives who early on offered a team of detectives to help. The FBI, they were notified immediately, and all they were allowed to do was to set up a trace on the phone, on the Ramsey's phone, in case there was a contact made by the killer, but they were restricted from even going into the crime scene. We know now that the FBI is giving some support that's been acknowledged by the Boulder DA anyway, that police are involved, FBI, CBI, other law enforcement agencies are involved. So what we hope that there's been sufficient pressure brought on by the family. There's been an online petition to force the governor of Colorado, or encourage the governor of Colorado, can't really force this, but encourage him to take the case away from the Boulder police and give it to the CBI or Denver or some other competent law enforcement agency, to investigate it. And I think all of that's kind of forced Boulder PD to internally, look at, well, how well is this done? And one of the major things that happened back in December 6th of last year, 2022, is an internal investigation by the Boulder Police Department found the captain of detectives and 5 subordinates. This IA, Internal Affairs Investigation, came back with a sustained complaint that the investigators were not thoroughly investigating the cases that they had. And that was the big issue that Lou had was,
Right.
Well, there's suspects here in the Ramsey case that really need to be followed up. There's evidence that need to be followed up. When the Boulder police did acknowledge that this captain was disciplined, he was taken out of the investigations, put on midnight patrol, other detectives disciplined for not thoroughly investigating the cases. In the press release that they released, they said, well, this has nothing to do with the Ramsey case. But the reality is it has everything to do with the Ramsey case, because that's been the culture with Boulder police, is that they did not thoroughly investigate the Jon Benet Ramsey case. So we hope it's getting a competent review now. One of the motivations for me writing the book when I did was to highlight the physical evidence and the facts of the case through the lens of Lou Smith, probably one of the finest homicide detectives that we've ever produced here in Colorado. Thank you for putting that up. I might mention that the book is available on Amazon, hardcover, softcover, as an ebook, or as an audio book. And out of Lou's 632 slides, I did put 36 slides as photos in the middle of the book. And then if you are doing the audio book, so obviously you couldn't have photos, the publisher did put an additional 20 slides on their website that I talk about. So between the book and the website, there's 56 of Lou's slides, which do show, again, the crime scene details of the stun gun marks, the garrote. And what we encourage is people to go through the book, the case, the evidence for 2 reasons. One is, I think there's a lot of lessons that can be learned today, from law enforcement agencies. So let's keep an open mind when we're investigating this case. And if I can leave one final thought from what we refer to as a Sherlockian theory, is it's the quote from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle in one of the early Sherlock Holmes stories. Is Sherlock Holmes in the story says, do not allow the theories to dictate the facts, allow the facts to dictate the theories. And I think that's one of the major flaws in this investigation at the very beginning, is there were theories that were asserted from the investigators, initially from Boulder PD, who in many cases based upon misinformation, that there's no footprints in the snow, there's no forced entry. Well, there was forced entry. And around that window, Lou pointed out there was no footprints in the snow because there was no snow. It was a southern facing side of the house in Colorado, the southern facing portion of the home, the snow usually melts quicker. And Lou showed crime scene photos of the backside of the house where that entry was the south side, there was no snow. But if somebody is trying to take the physical evidence and force that to fit the theory that the parents did it, that it was an accidental death from one of the parents, that the brother did, or whatever, what they're doing is they're ignoring the facts of the case, the physical evidence, and they're picking portions of the evidence, the facts, and then trying to turn that to fit their theory that it was a family member. And what Lou always suggested, and this goes back to 200 years ago with Conan Doyle when he wrote the series, the Sherlock Holmes series, is allow the facts to dictate the theories, not the theories to dictate the facts.
Right.
I think that the other theory that I'll just leave on is one that's well known as Lockhart's theory of interchange, or the transfer theories that detectives, police officers all over the world are familiar with. Is anytime a crime is committed, the suspect either takes something or leaves something at the crime scene. And that theory of interchange is something that Lou knew very well and built his career on. And when you look at the physical evidence that you mentioned earlier, that what were the things that the suspect brought with him into the crime scene he introduced? What are the things that he left with? The duct tape, the roll of duct tape, the stun gun, the paracord. When you look at all those pieces of physical evidence, the physical evidence supports the theory that it was exactly as the ransom note says. It was an attempted kidnap for ransom that ended up in the murder of this little girl. What we hope is that the book will encourage people to take a more objective look at the case, particularly what Lou believed all along, that the DNA, as it continues to, technologies evolve, get better every year, databases continue to grow, that it's going to be the DNA that's going to someday solve the case of the murder of Jon Benet Ramsey.
Absolutely. How close do you think you are to solving this? I mean, obviously, again, no names or anything like that, but do you think that, you guys are like, there's certain suspects that we know that this could be the case?
Yeah. What's really amazing to us, Pete, is every time we've gotten a person of interest and we've fixated on them, some of the ones we've spent a week, before we could get a piece of evidence. We have one piece of evidence back at the lab now. And but every time we have sent an article or sample in, we thought, this is the one. This is the one. This is because we go through our top 20 and say, who's our very best candidate. And each time we have done that, we thought, oh, we've got it. We just need, this is the one that's going to, we're going to get that lab report back, and this is going to be the one. And almost all of these people were all of them were in Lou's, initial report. And so they were in Boulder at the time. And many of them were talked to, interviewed by the police back then. They just didn't have their DNA taken. And every time we sent one in, we thought, this is the one that we're going to get hit this time. And it's so disheartening to get it back. That lab report says negative, or not this one, or no match. And it's really been a frustrating thing. So we hope that the article we have back there now leads to it. What we hope is that the book and the pressure from the family has brought about a cold case review in Colorado. And we hope those detectives, will take a fresh look at the case, the evidence, and encourage, a retesting of the evidence, just like what Lou did with the fingerprint from Heather Dawn Church. He sent it to 96 other laboratories, and had he not done that, this killer would have remained, Robert Brown would have remained in our community, and likely active, as a serial killer. So we think when the DNA is finally matched, or we get into the familial DNA and get into that family tree that's going to lead us to that person, that there's going to be a series. The likelihood of this being a one-off is not very good. So anything's possible, but it does appear that there was such a methodical, planned attempted kidnap for ransom, and such a violent sexual assault on the victim that there's almost certainly going to be a pattern there of criminal behavior and violent behavior.
Yeah. Well, I believe and I hope that you guys solve this. It would be just monumental, in this case, and for the justice for the little girl. It's
Yeah.
just one of those things. But this book, Lou and John Benet, available on Amazon. Let's look at some of your other books. You got seven. Well, you had 8 books total,
Right.
but you have 7 others. You want to run down real quick here on these 3, and then I'll pull up the other 4.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I don't want this to end on a commercial, but share another passion that I have. I've always
Call 1-800. No, I'm just kidding.
That's right. I've always been fascinated with the work of the writing of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and I had to ask Pete if he was any relation, and it's not that he knows of, but I've read all the 56 short stories, the 4 novels, many times of Sherlock Holmes and his adventures, and that might have been what, as a very young boy, what caused me to
Sure.
want to become a investigator, homicide detective, and I still enjoy the series. So for those people that like the series, there's always been a gap year, 1896, where he published up to that day a year, and then afterwards. But where was he during that time? So serious Sherlockians have always speculated, where did he go? So I answer that question. Sherlock Holmes comes to Little London, which is what Colorado Springs was known in as during the Victorian era. The top one that you're showing is my most ambitious work. I've always loved history and Colorado history in particular, American Southwest, but this is 26 short stories that I wrote of nearly forgotten history in Colorado from 1776 to 1876 when Colorado becomes a state. The third one down there is Zach Bach's, my first science fiction novel. And then I have 2 books I wrote on culturally modified trees, Native American prairie trees. On the left-hand side, I've always wanted to be an author, a writer, since I loved reading all of my life. And when I became the sheriff, I was fascinated with how little was known about the first sheriff of El Paso County in 1861, Rankin Scott Kelly. He was the real deal. He was involved in forced shootouts with outlaws, had his horse shot out from under him twice. So the bottom left one is a nonfiction as a historical account of Sheriff Kelly, the first sheriff. I was the 26th sheriff, but there was so much information missing out of his fascinating career that I had to fill in the gaps. So so the top left one is a historical fiction of Sheriff Kelly, and I tried to stay pretty close to the truth, but occasionally there's a little deviation. And then on the right-hand side are 2 similar books of the Native American prairie trees, culturally modified trees that you can still find here in the Pikes Peak area and throughout Colorado. Is that top one. So I've tried to come up with different ones that people might like if they like history or science fiction or historical fiction. I've got 3 other books that I'm working on now, and but this one was really a special one because it is really a tribute. It's dedicated to Lou Smith and Dave Spencer, who passed away on 2 years ago on the anniversary of Jon Benet's death. And what I realized is that with Dave gone, I needed to really kind of step up because, none of us know how long we're going to be here. And there was a lot of historical knowledge from the case that was passed on from Lou and then to Dave. And I realized that, I turned 70 here in a few months and my memory's not getting sharper. and as I get involved in another case, the facts of this case, start to diminish a little bit. When I start on writing another book, I thought, I owe it to Dave and to Lou, and more importantly to Jon Benet, to put everything I can on print and do the best job I can in representing the facts of the case as objectively as I can, and encourage people to, keep an open mind and continue looking at the advances in DNA technology and never giving up. Unsolved cases, there's no statute limitations on a first-degree murder. So if we can just get that first hit, we wish the law enforcement in the Boulder community or the state crime lab or FBI or whoever, much success with the case, but we're not going to give up. Our team is here. We've got, we're sufficiently funded. We're all volunteers, so we don't get paid. The only thing we use the money for is for travel or lab, occasionally to pay somebody for a sample, but that doesn't happen very often. So it's a slow process, but we'll continue working it until we can't anymore. But Lou's grandchildren are getting involved in our team, which is really kind of encouraging. So they're really some sharp young people. So we hope that we'll get the news anytime that Boulder's made an arrest, and the rest of us can go retire and do something else. But till then, we'll stay on it.
Yeah, it's good to have another generation coming up that's not going to forget about the case, So hopefully it continues on until it's solved.
Well, thank you, Pete, for
John,
being so generous with your time and the time and the energy you put into this before you even brought me up, the research that you've done. I really appreciate you sharing this with all of your listeners and viewers, and if I can, people always ask, at the end of a program or when I do a talk, what can we do to help? And there's two things, and I don't want this to sound self-serving, but it does make a difference. If you do read the book, if you could do a review on Amazon, because the more reviews, as you know, Pete, from your background, the higher up in the rankings you go and the more exposure you get. So there's kind of this snowball effect. So if you do think the book is worthwhile, please take a few minutes to do a review. And then the second thing, if you're financially able, to make a donation, to go online and Pete, maybe I can send you the link,
Absolutely.
I think there's three different GoFundMe accounts. So I'll send you a link if you don't mind putting it on yours. But even if it's just, $10, $25 or whatever, that financial contributions, those add up. And we appreciate the small donations as much as we do the large ones.
Absolutely. It's going towards a good cause here to help, not just with this case, but I'm sure with others that you guys will be focused on. So that's great. Yeah, absolutely. Send those on to me, and we'll get them up on our social media and everything else. John, thank you so much for your time. It was a pleasure talking with you. Thank you for all the insight. And, hopefully we get some good news here in the near future on this case.